Modern India. We have four distinguished speakers. Professor Habib would be talking to us on Ashoka. Professor Shirin Muswi would be speaking on Akbar. Dr. Sarkar will be telling us on Ramon Roy. And Professor Aditya Mukherjee will be speaking on Jawaharlal Nehru. And so we start the day with Professor Habib's presentation. I request Professor Habib to kindly make the presentation.
Mr. Chairman and friends, the Aligarh Historian Society was not very original, perhaps, in choosing these four major figures as makers of what we know as India, down history. I remember my school, which was in 1940s, when one of our popular teachers came. He had a book, dog-eared book, V.S. Smith's Ashok, and in which there was an illustration of the Rumandi inscription. And he told us, children, this is your first writing. This is where our writing has come from, the Brahmi script of Ashoka's Rumandi inscription. And therefore I shall start first, and that was my first impression that I received on Ashoka from my history school teacher. So the first thing I should like to mention is that Ashoka gave us writing. Before Ashoka, there was no writing in India. Indus culture had pictographs or radiographs which we can't read. In any case, the texts were small. Ashokan inscriptions inscribed in no less than 40 places in northern India, Afghanistan, and what previously used to be known as the Deccan down to the Carnatic Plateau. More than 40 places. These are real texts in Brahmi and Kharoshti characters, and also Greek and Aramaic, which inscriptions have been discovered mainly in the last 50 years. So, writing came to us, our civilization, with Ashoka. It is true that in Sri Lanka first, certain Brahmi characters were discovered from levels which went back to 4th or even 5th century BC. And then in Tamil Nadu, on some pottery, there have been discoveries of names written in both Tamil Brahmi and Brahmi, which also go back to about 5th century BC. So the story of the coming of Brahmi to India has become complex. But certainly long texts are there from Ashoka alone. And there is another important thing that Ashokan Brahmi represents. In Aramaic, like Arabic, its descendant, short vowels have no letters. They are just understood. And mainly letters are confined to consonants and a few long vowels. That character Kharoshti has, which comes alone with Ashoka. There no Kharoshti character previous to Ashoka has been discovered, which was in use in northwestern India, which is now, of course, Pakistan. But as far as Brahmi characters are concerned, in Brahmi characters, you have signs for short vowels. Where there is no sign, you assume that there is a short vowel, and there are signs for long vowels. This is very different from Tamil Brahmi, which has separate consonants and separate vowels. And there are certain letters, certain consonants, which are not found in Sri Lankan Brahmi or in Tamil Brahmi. So the entire Brahmi script, which survives in Nagari script and almost all Dravidian and Central Indian, North Indian scripts, except of course derivatives from Arabic. These scripts go back to Brahmi in their all their forms. In fact, Tamil today doesn't go back to Tamil Brahmi, it goes back to Brahmi. And that is the work of Ashoka alone. So first, the writing comes with Ashoka. Now let us remember that the coming of writing is not just an ordinary event, it changes the entire civilization. The mode of administration, what was previously done as in the Aztec or Inca empires of the New World, use of memory, use of certain ties or strings to help memory, which have all disappeared because they don't last, and oral transmission. Just see how difficult all that was for an empire like the Mauryan Empire, and indeed for intercultural transmission within the country. Ashokan Brahmi changed all that. It gave a totally new instrument for intercultural transmission and for imperial administration. So the way Ashoka used it and the way Ashokan Brahmi spread in his time, that is also very important. It's not only his own inscriptions, but other people, ordinary people, were learning it, like that famous romantic inscription where a pecuniary artist from Banaras in central India, Rajghat Hills, he has left an inscription about a Devadasi whom he loves. So this, and from the way that La acts for Ra, it is obvious that it is Ashokan or immediately post Ashokan. So an ordinary artist had also learned to write. Therefore writing was spreading. And then of course Ashoka's inscriptions show that he intended or he hoped that some people would read it. Although he says that officials should read it out aloud to people and perhaps translate it in local dialects. Ashokan inscriptions themselves in Prakrit are in 4 dialects, which are close to each other but have distinct forms. There is and then the other fact of the content of Ashokan inscriptions that also becomes important. They are not prashastis. They are not praises of Ashoka himself. They are not courtiers' writings as, Rudradaman's Girnar inscription of 150 AD or Samudragupta's Harishena's prashasti for Samudragupta or all the prashastis. There is nothing like that. It is Ashoka addressing his subjects, Ashoka addressing his people. They may be Indians, they may be Greeks, they were Aramics writing Iranians in Afghanistan, but they are his people and he is addressing them. This is a very major element in Ashokan, a unique element in Ashokan inscriptions, not found elsewhere in later inscriptions, almost totally absent, an address of the ruler to his people. They are in series. I won't discuss these in series. I've already said they are in 40 places on rocks and pillars, and they have been distinguished as minor rock edicts, major rock edicts, pillar edicts, individual pillar inscriptions, and so on. But what are they about? That is also important. He is addressing his subjects. But what are the edicts about? Now, one very interesting thing in these edicts, which is often missed, is that he has a sense of social contract. He owes a debt to his subjects. A curious notion, very seldom appearing among rulers, Achaemenian emperors. Do they say that we owe debt to, I owe a debt to my subjects? Nothing. They owe debt to, he owes debt to his subjects. What is that? And obviously, he takes taxes, so he is bound to oblige his subjects. His officers are in debt to him. They take salaries and therefore they are answerable to him. The very interesting theory in two variations of the social contract. These texts, these edicts are often in copies. In most cases, they survive in copies, except Pillar 7th Edict, which survives only in one copy in the Topra Delhi pillar. But otherwise, they are in copies. Which means that the same order went forth throughout the empire. Aramaic and Greek in all the edicts also are copies or translations of Ashokan inscriptions. Now, clearly, Ashoka is a Buddhist. Minor Rock Edict 1 makes this clear, and if it was not made clear, it would be made clear by the Ceylonese and the northern Buddhist tradition, the Mahayana and Hinayana traditions, Theravada traditions both. And he recognizes it, he says, and he repeats it in his inscriptions, that he patronizes Sangha, Shramanas, Satsanga, Brahmans, Jainas, and even Ajivikas who are condemned by all sects, but he patronizes them. He has left also caves in South Bihar dedicated to Ajivikas. So he is a Buddhist, but he is a tolerant Buddhist. And his edicts, contrary to what is generally thought, are not for propagating Buddhism. In fact, he insists on religious tolerance. Now, I have just said religious tolerance. I have been speaking about religion. But the point was that in Ashokan times, there was religion had not been recognized as a religion. Dharma meant morality, prescribed practice. It was even only in Buddhism that Dhamma meant also doctrine. I believe in Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha. But there is no particular religion. Nobody speaks of Hindu Dharma. Of course, the word Hindu is an Arabic word, so it's a much later, but even what we would now call Brahmanism, there was no name to describe it. So the curious word which is used in Ashokan inscriptions for religion, and surprisingly, this has been missed by most interpreters. They just say that it means religion, and that is Pasanda. Pasanda is the Prakrit form of Pahand, which is in Hindi Pakhand, and which meant plainly heretic. Brahmans called Buddhists Pasandas. Buddhists called Jainas and Brahmans Pashandas. So Ashoka was at a loss as far as the name for religion is concerned, and that speaks much of the situation at the time. So he uses this word Pachanda, which is in fact derogatory for all religions, but he had no option because Dhamma he was using for morality. So in Rock Edict 12 he says that there should be peace among the various Pashandas or sects, religious sects. They should discuss each other, they should not abuse each other, they should not overpraise themselves. very good instructions which many important men and women in India should read today. It almost seems as if it had been issued after some particular speech by Mr. Shah or someone of that sort, Ashoka's Rock Edict 12. What does his Dhamma consist of? His Dhamma has little to do with Buddhism, almost nothing. It is for an ethical life in worldly pursuits. He is not asking his subjects to seek Nibbana or Nirvana. In fact, that word never occurs. He is quite satisfied with heaven, Swagga or Swarg. Let them be ethical, let them respect their father and mother, let them be kind to slaves and servants, a very important instruction. Let them be generous to Brahmans and Shramans, both Buddha Brahman priests and Shramans. Let them not take life, not be violent. Ahimsa is certainly indicated, and they should not slaughter a number of animals, which one of the pillar edicts lists. Surprisingly, cow and bullocks are not in that list. So obviously he knew that certain animals had to be slaughtered for food. He himself says that in my kitchen many deer and peacocks were being slaughtered, but now only 2 peacocks and 1 deer every day. Although that, of course, was also a large diet order, I must say, but he still was realist enough to say that vegetarianism cannot be just proclaimed. Now, what is interesting is that he sees these ethics as aids to worldly life. And when he transmits these edicts into Aramaic and Greek, both in very good language, he realizes that Zoroastrians have a sense of day of judgment. You know, the Jewish, Christian and Muslim belief in the day of judgment comes from the Zoroastrian day of judgment. So there he doesn't talk about heaven, he talks about the day of judgment. If you follow these advices that I give you, then you will not have trouble in the day of judgment. Of course, he doesn't mention God. He's an atheist. God is nowhere there. Gods are and goddesses are nowhere there. But heaven is there, and the day of judgment is there for the Iranians. For Greeks, he realizes they don't believe in afterlife. Afterlife seems to be them nonsensical. So there's nothing about afterlife or paradise in his Greek edicts. This is just right, and so do it. It just means that, contrary to what we might think, Ashoka had a message different from Buddhism. That message everyone's beliefs, whether they were Brahmans or ordinary people, late Upasaks, or they were Jains, or they were Zoroastrians, or they were rational Greeks. It was an address made to them. And therefore, one must also praise Ashoka for bringing forth the concept of a secular morality. A morality in worldly life getting across borders. And that in this morality, I would also like to point out a very important fact. I hope I'm overstepping my time, so I will be now quick. And that is what I've already said, that first of all, there is this particular motion to look after slaves and servants. He's not abolishing slavery, he's only arguing in 5 places in his edicts that you should be very kind to slaves and servants, bhattakas and dasas. This brings us to another an interesting factor, which again is not given adequate attention among Ashoka's interpreters, an absolute absence of caste. The Varna in Prakrit Banna never occurs in the edicts. Jati never attacks, in both Sanskrit and Prakrit the same word, Jati never occurs in his edicts. He never says, follow the caste system. This particular view of humanity, divided certainly among rich and poor, but not divided according to caste, this particular refusal to give any concession to caste is certainly very important and something we can all learn from. Why this happened? Because we know Megasthenes had described the caste system very accurately. He had said 7 castes. In fact, there were much more than 7 varnas in actual practice. There were intermediate varnas, there were the 4 major varnas, then there were those outside the varnas, then there were intermediate varnas, as Kautilya says in Arthashastra. So that number doesn't go against Megasthenes' descriptions, but otherwise that description is very clear. So caste system was established at least in Magad and other areas. We also learn from Buddhist literature that Jati system was very strongly involved as far as marriages were concerned. But Ashoka totally ignores caste. That also perhaps we should learn from. Then let me go to the other elements which also make Ashoka a very great creative figure in the country. There was no concept of the country of India before Ashoka. Even the word Aryavarta doesn't occur in any text firmly datable before Ashoka. Arthashastra, we know, was a later compilation. Manusmriti is a later compilation. But Ashoka's inscriptions spread all over. His inscriptions, his edicts describing the administration or assuming administrative processes throughout the country. His geographical references showing that Cholas and Pandyas and Keralaputas and Satyaputas were outside the empire, but others were inside all regions. There's a concept of not only empire, but a concept of India, for which the name he uses is Jambudvipa. In Rock Edict 1, Minor Rock Edict 1, Jambudvipa. In Sanskrit, Jambudvipa. This is perhaps the first recorded name of our country. Bharata is first used by Kharavela in Orissa in the 1st century BC for the first time among inscriptions. So the Mauryan Empire is identified in his mind with a country, a cultural unit that is described as India or Jambudvipa. Finally, India, the history of Indian fine art begins with Ashoka. I don't know how it happens, but wherever you look in fine art, you go to Ashoka. Architecture, first places of cave architecture, constructing caves, is Ashokan. There's no cave or structure, architecture before Ashoka but the name. Then the Mauryan polish there which can't be replicated. Then the pillars, the great stone pillars which at Sanchi will be found and also in Madhya Pradesh, but are mainly found in Bihar and Uttar Pradesh and Haryana. These pillar inscriptions, whether they came from Chunar stone or other sources are not known, but it would be an enormous labor transporting them from one place to another and then setting them as. But to look at the grace of each pillar, the plain base and up to the capital, then the bell-shaped capital, which in the Iranian architecture was at the bottom, but Ashok puts at the top, and then the top sculpture, whether lion or horse or elephant or 4 lions, as in Sarnath. Not only the beauty and grace of it, but also the skill of it. How did such sculptural skill come? Marshall was trained in study of classical art, and he says about Sarnath lions that this is unsurpassed in ancient world. No such sculpture exists in the entire ancient world. And I bow to that decision because, unlike me, Marshall had studied his archaeology and architecture in Greece and Rome, Italy. And then, true, and that is the one thing I will end with. True, Ashoka was influenced in his architecture and sculpture by both Greek and Achaemenian art. The grace of many of his constructions remind us of Greek art. Many of his things like bell-shaped capital, which he put at the top, are at the bottom in Achaemenian art. But this brings me to the final point. The cosmopolitanism of the man. I have already indicated that he had a notion of what the Greeks believed, how they should be addressed. They should laugh out if you say you will go to heaven. They know there is no heaven. Talk to Zoroastrians in the day of judgment because that is what they believe. Talk to Indians because they are more superstitious, they believe in heaven, that you can go to Sagga. So, he is a man which we find to be a man of familiar with various cultures, various beliefs. And therefore he combines 2 major elements of world art at that time in what is known singly as Mauryan art. And that too, perhaps, is a lesson for us. Not to be parochial, not to be looking always inward, and be ready to learn from others. Thank you.
I would like to request Professor Shirin Musvi, please come on stage.
Mr. Chairman, Professor Irfan Habib, fellow speakers and fellow delegates. We have just heard Professor Irfan Habib's discourse on Ashok as one of the principal figures in Indian history. Now I am to take up Akbar, and perhaps we will be seeing quite a few similarities in both the great men of our country, whom we have called here as the makers of India. I'll begin with rather at a more lighter, in a more lighter vein. There was once a time when Ashok and Akbar used to be on the lips of Indian nationalists as illustrations of how good our own rulers were, how better governed we were with them. Lord Curzon remarks in a letter how one day Surendranath Banerjee came to him and asked him for something, which he did. He obliged him. Before leaving, he profusely thanked him and said that he put him in the same class as Ashok and Akbar. Curzon verily adds afterwards that from there he went to another meeting where Curzon was likened to Genghis Khan and Halagu. But anyway, this is rather obvious that during the national movement, these were the two figures which were celebrated as the best rulers of the country. Akbar was certainly marked as a conqueror and an empire builder. In 1556, a boy of 15, he inherited a shaky empire, and it was an exceptional genius, manifested superbly in his generalship, that he expanded it into an all-India empire covering reaching up till the Bengal and having Deccan and of course the whole of North India up till the Kabul, west and north, every place. This was but it is Akbar's reign, perhaps, which for the first time very clearly marked, India in his reign very clearly be marked as a political entity. This is borne out by Abul Fazl's well-known dictum that Kabul and Kandahar are twin gates of Hindustan. One may very well say that before Akbar, perhaps India was more of a cultural entity rather than a geographical and a political entity. But now the situation changes. Abul Fazl further adds that by possession of these two spacious passages, Hindustan is made secured from foreigners. The implicit identification of Hindustan with the Mughal Empire here is made explicit in the Ain-e Akbari, where he talks of the account of he gives what was the administration of this country and what was divided into, how the 12 were later on, the 14 subas came into being, and all those further details about it. But the concept of India being or Mughal Empire being identical with India was very strong. The identification of Mughal Empire with whole of India was asserted again and again. And the whole of India was, and the whole people of India were also Akbar's own, and therefore one feels rather very unhappy when one finds Jarrett mistranslating everywhere the word Hindi with Hindu, where it is said, Danishgarai Hind, he would say, which means wise Indians, that will be translated wise Hindu philosophers. If it is Hindi Nijad, it is not, he won't translate it as Indian, a people of Indian origin, he would say Hindus. So one can see that how simply if the word is Ahle Hind, the people of India, Jarrett's translation would say Hindus only. Ahl and all that goes away. So this sort of a distortion was still there, but there was a total identification of India with Akbar's empire, and those of all Indian people, irrespective of their any allegiances or religions, they were all the Ahle Hind, the people of India, and therefore Akbar's own people. It was not only that, it is the period when for the first time, even the parts of India which were not under Akbar's control, as students of historiography, we must have interested into that, those were also considered to be part of India. So you would not only have Tabqat-e-Akbari discussing or incorporating in its own discussion the regions which were yet to be conquered, but Farishta in his book going over to the Gulshan-e-Ibrahimi, going over to even the ancient period. So it was not all parts of geographical India which was part of India, it was the entire Indian past was a part of Akbar's inheritance. So the entire idea that how India has to be seen was changing now. It was not only on the theoretical basis that one will say that this was occurring, it was also on the basis of practical, say, making of a country in a practical manner. How Akbar was to govern India was totally a unique idea. The whole of the country was divided into geographical units of subas, say, sarkars, and further division of parganas, parganas consisting of the villages. And the whole country was divided into various subas, 12 earlier, and then up till the end they became 15. And now not only the territory was divided into that, the way it has to be governed was also to be divided and to have an extremely centralized government. The emperor is on the top. Below him are the important as far as administration is concerned, 4 ministers, the wazir, which afterwards became less important, but the diwan or diwan-e-ala, the finance minister or revenue minister, and then the bakhshi, the minister of intelligence, and what you will say, the one who also look after the army, and then the sadr. Now, if the empire is divided, it's not that their function, they are rather under each other. In a suba, governor has nothing to do with the revenue, the diwan of the suba. He is totally independent of it. And the bakhshi of the province is also independent of it. There is a direct chain. The chain begins with the emperor. Emperor has his own ministers. These ministers have at suba level their own counterparts. These suba level officials have their counterpart at the sarkar level, and the sarkar level officials have their counterpart at the pargana level, and they have their subordinate at the village level. How then the whole work is done? A small peasant is being exploited, or he's rather have some grievances in Sambhal. And without the governor or even the revenue minister knowing about it at the Suba Sarkar or any level. The emperor comes to know through the Bakhshi, his own Bakhshi-e-Mamalik, that this is happening to the peasant. And there is a farman of Akbar to the governor, such and such peasant in such and such village has grievances. He has to be sent at the cost of the state or the government under protection to the court so that I could hear his grievances. How one can think in the 16th century administration could have worked in this manner. So it was a sort of a unique, and then there was another very important thing as far as Akbar is concerned, as the Jesuits say, that he never left a room when how he made himself accessible to all people, particularly the smaller ones. We have an example on which Professor Habib has written or brought out rather, that there was a small calico painter, Ram Das, who met Akbar, and he was perhaps the first person who was granted a Jagir, because it was that a village was assigned to him in revenue. And Akbar maintained a relationship with him even while he became half senile and gave him redress whenever he wrote to him. So, and then if you read Jesuits' father's accounts, you will be finding out that they say that the most important nobles would bring gift, Akbar won't have a look at them, but if a poor man brings the berries, he would not only accept them, put it to his heart, and embrace the person. So it was a different sort of a monarch we are talking about. Not, it was, say, confined to this sort of an action, but there were things which were rather more important than what one may say, and that was his concept of government. Just now we have heard about Ashoka. Akbar has another way of asserting his position, but at the same time making room for everyone. The emperor is the Farre-Ezidi, is a ray of light from the creator himself. And therefore, he is not a part of the creator, he is not a Zillillah, he is not his shadow, but he himself is divine. There is an idea of social contract here as well. But in this social contract, unlike Ashok, he is not answerable or answerable to the subject he is governing, but he is answerable only to the creator. And therefore, while he gives grants to the temples and to the Brahmins, the mullahs go to complaint, and he said they also have a religion. They also are the worshipper of the god. While the Jain comes and they get the grants, the famous Shantidas, then there is now the complaint by the Brahmins and the mullahs both. They are not believers at all. They have no god. They don't worship any god. What's the reply? Yes, but all the bounties of the Almighty God, the Creator, are available to them as to anyone else. How, as being a ray of light from Him, I can deny them anything? So this is a totally different sort of a word which is, or an idea which he is creating. I don't want to take much of your time, but I would like to have a little more about how we have to look at him, and perhaps that is what one have to go to look, how he introduced the concept of Sulh-e-Kul, which was separate from this idea of Farre-Ezidi. And he started off as a true Muslim. While he received a lot of success, he wanted to thank his God, and he started off with an Ibadat Khana, which was confined only to the Muslims and rather the Muslim theologians. But soon enough, his ideas started changing. There is a widening. In the case of Akbar, you can always see the gradual evaluation of his thought. So he made it open nearly to all the schools of thought of Muslims. But soon enough, he got too fed up with those sort of a discussion, and he has thrown it open to the Jesuits, to the Jains, to the Pandits, to the Brahmins, and to the Danishwar. And soon enough, he was no more ready. Of course, in the meantime, there was an attempt to be the leader of the Muslims, the arbiters of Islam in our Islamic world as well, but he soon gave up that idea. And instead of that, he came up with the idea of the Sulh-e-Kul, the perfect peace. And more than that, he became a believer in reason. A believer in reason who was more interested in technology, who was more, unlike the Muslim concept, he was more interested in paintings where it is the natural painting, the painting which would show everything in its natural form, a naturalist. And whether it is the paintings, it is also the architecture which will have a Catholic touch, Trabeate, Arcuate, all those sorts of things would be mixed. He would be experimenting in technology himself. He would say that if you want to cool the water, you have to have the saltpeter to do that work. And at one place he says in his saying, I realized the importance of salt once added to saltpeter. It freezes the water. Almost a discovery of freezing mixture much before Europe has done. He's also credited for having a ship camel made at two places to carry the ship, to construct the ship on the bank of the rivers, deep rivers, and to carry the ship in the deep sea or in the deep water on that ship. It was generally we always read this was the discovery of the Dutch, but much before that, Akbar at least tried to practice it. So we have a personality who is a believer in reason and in technology and all those things. I would end this, and a person who is really so down to earth and too close to his people that once he dies, a small merchant, Banarsi Das, who was up till now Shaivite, hears it sitting in Benares on top of his house, and the minute he comes to know that Akbar is no more, he falls down, he gets such a shock, breaks his skull. And then he gets up while he is better, he decides that Lord Shiva was neither able to protect the emperor nor me, and he converts to Jainism. So here is a man whom Akbar would have never heard of, but who can, sitting far away, he could do that. The best tribute to him is perhaps, as Pandit Nehru has written in his Glimpses of World History, comes from the Jesuits. The Jesuits at Akbar's court, he writes, said that this prince recorded that this prince had the common fault of all the atheists who would not believe anything not sanctioned by reason. And Nehru adds, if to follow reason is to be regarded as a fault of the atheist, I hope we would have more and more such people in our country. Thank you very much.
Dr. Jawad Sarkar, please join us.
Mr. Chairman, sir, respected Professor Saab, respected Professor Shireen Musvi, my very brilliant friend, Mr. Aditya Mukherjee, will speak after me. I must compliment the Aligarh Historian Society for coming up with this thematic analysis of four great persons who constitute the soul of India, who laid the foundation of what we would like to consider as India. Thank you for the opportunity. I have been working a bit on Ram Mohan Roy and chose this particular framework of considering him as one of the four makers of India. The task is a little difficult because, as you're all aware, Ram Mohan is the only one among the four who was not in control of state power and in no inherent position to influence state power. He was a native subject of a colonial country that had been impacted by repeated series of wars, battles, and domination. This is the context in which we get an Indian who arises above the status into which he was born, and he certainly surpasses all his contemporaries, but we need to view him in a far greater role as a maker of India. I would come to a series of points, but the first three that strike me as his strategy, if I may use the term, or his terms of success, were A, to absorb the best that English education and Western wisdom at that point of time could convey. Marry it with the best of Indian wisdom as expressed through two separate traditions, the Sanskritic and the Arabic Farsi. He could absorb from the atmosphere of a defeated country, of a colonized country, the best of wisdom that was available, to imbibe them, to work out his strategies for success within the framework of what he had gathered, and to demonstrate with a certain amount of equality of status. I shall come to these points when I mention equality of status. That is what distinguishes the first Indian within the first 60 years of the Battle of Plassey. Between the Battle of Plassey and 1909, when we get the first dated recognition of Ram Mohan, we find not a single Indian had been given that status, that procurement of the status of equality. I'll leave behind a paper where there are several quotes from the Missionary Register of London, from various other papers of London, from the American Review of 1818. Now we must remember that Ram Mohan's operational life was just 21 years. His operational period of life was 21 years because in the preceding period, he was earning money enough to live off that money for the remaining 21 years, if I may put it. I mean, there are various issues connected with what he earned and the way he did it, but we come to what he left behind, not in terms of wealth, but in terms of India and its agenda. So there are these very, very laudatory references that I'm leaving behind as a bits of evidence. What strikes us first, as I had started with by mentioning the different cultural streams, is the extraordinary gift of communication that we could write and converse in Sanskrit, Bengali, Persian, Arabic, and English. A person, but when we look beyond the polyglot or beyond his capacity to understand 5 languages, we miss out a very subtle point, that is his capacity for cross-culturalism. His capacity for cross-culturalism comes out to set the agenda of India, of modern India. It's his cross-culturalism, his rare adroitness to navigate between different cultures and ideas and compare as well as draw the finest substance of each. His masterly cross-cultural communications is what, in my submission, marks out Ram Mohan from the entire generation of learned Indians of that time, or even much later. He was the first Indian of modern India who proudly upheld and reinforced the age-old plural tradition, and we may need to evaluate him in the light of his uncompromising secularism. He suffered for his rationality, as we shall see in little bits and pieces, not only in the hands of Hindus that we know so well, but also from his best friends in Christianity, among the Christian missionaries. But none could deny his essential grasp over religious texts and the context of religion. His primary mission was that of religion and the allied society that came in its trail, along with education and others. Now, so even as they contested his interpretation and arguments, and they did it most bitterly, they could hardly ever deny his grasp over both religion and the essential texts and scriptures. And here, this is a lesson that we tend to ignore in today's India, where I would humbly submit that the dangers posed by religious obscurantism are as great as they were 200 years ago. The context has changed, the bitterness has not. As they were 200 years ago, in terms of the viciousness of attacks and the trail of death and destruction that follow. I would submit we take inspiration from Ram Mohan in the light of not only his courage to uphold to his own principles, but to the strategy that he evolved, a very successful strategy of understanding the core of religion and to make out a public discourse, to come out publicly with what he would consider the perversion of religion, prove his point. It was his convincing grasp over essentials of religion that stood him out in his battle. As we shall see, state power would come to the aid of his mission only when it suited him, suited state power. We can go through a lot of other points as well, and we need to go through some of them that mark him out as the first modern Indian. Number one, I would submit, is the range of socially relevant subjects that Ram Mohan picked up. The sheer mind-boggling range of subjects that one individual picked up for understanding, for propagation, and for convincing. I am not even picking up the favorite subject of idolatry, monotheism, and other things except in passing. That remains his primary mission, because when we refer to him as the first modern Indian, we refer to him for many other reasons as well. Sati and others I'll touch in the context of what actually history should tell us of the battle at that. Who were the players and how did they react? The second perhaps reason that for which I would hold him so high is his battle against idolatry, or putting it the other way around, his overriding rationalism. His overriding rationalism for which he paid a very heavy price. The third small point I will touch very briefly now and try to elucidate if time permits, is his passionate plea for women's education and rights. This gets completely covered in his other tasks, and we need to extricate these texts and bring them out in the public domain as the first person in modern India who spoke on these subjects. There are, in fact, a considerable amount of literature that Ram Mohan produces on the issue of women's rights as distinguished from the oppression through sati. He distinguishes the two, and when he talks of rights, he uses terms like legal legitimate rights in the text. I'll come to that a little later. As we move along, the fourth major reason that I would submit is this plea for the best of Western education, which was distinct from the task, distinct from the ideas of Macaulay. And we can come to that because he was looking for light in its own capacity for light and brilliance, not for servility. The fifth reason that I would submit is that though he himself was a Sanskrit scholar of considerable brilliance, because he took on the entire foray of Sanskrit scholars of his time, he protested when Sanskrit education was being extended. His great letter of protest of 1823 is not only a landmark in the agenda for education in modern India, but I'll touch upon that just a little later. But he considered at that point of time, and he considered that Sanskrit education was retrograde. We move on. We all know him as the father of the Indian Renaissance, but his capacity to articulate most effectively the causes that he had taken up. As I had hinted before, what marks out Ram Mohan in his mission is the fact that he had acquired or procured for himself through this discourse a status of assumed equality. An assumed equality in his debates with the British Empire, with the British colonial power. It was not yet an empire, it was British colonial power, which was most unusual for a black subject of that regime. Before I come to a couple of other points, I will also submit that inadvertently or otherwise, he is the first Indian writer in English. He communicates he starts a genre known as Indian writing in English. Let me also submit, while he was very effective, he is not considered the most brilliant of them. He is the first of them. There is another person before him called Deen Muhammad, whom I have to mention. But after Deen Muhammad, that is 1793, we get him in 1809. And unlike Deen Muhammad, who wrote one piece and then disappeared, Ram Mohan continued from 1809 to 1833, bringing out masterly volumes and setting the trend of what we call Indian literature in English. As we move along, many people tend to think that his obsession in communicating with English may have blunted his own desire, as it does in many of our cases, for his own mother tongue. Far from that, he never gave up his brilliance in communicating in Bangla, in Bengali, and became one of the founding, he is one of the fathers of Bengali prose. That's most unusual. I came to know only through my little research in the last few years. That is considered, because this way we have to live history and get into the history of Bangla literature to find out there are the three persons who were responsible for converting the communication in Bengali from traditional verse to prose are Ram Ram Basu, Mrityunjay Vriddalankar, and Ram Mohan. These are the three. So there again we find a first. And in my count, this is the 9th first that I have of this gentleman. As we move along, I have already touched upon the the price that he had to pay as a rationalist. Politically, he was a liberal. We have questioned many of his political thoughts, but his liberalism stands out. Now, I'll come to the first major battle. That's about 11 points already, but come to the first major battle of his life with Sati, the inhuman practice of the immolation of a woman, and bring out the role that has often been questioned by interrogative historians, that Bentinck, incidentally, the man who banned Sati, had already made up his mind. He's an old India hand. He has already made up his mind. He had served Madras before and has already made up his mind. So what is Ram Mohan's role? There are two major areas that this superficial question or argument omits. Number one, people who go through that history of that period, the correspondence of the British, would realize that what was standing against them in the abolition of this heinous practice was their inconfidence in being able to understand the Indian mood. A person who had actually banned it before him was the Marquis of Hastings. The Marquis of Hastings, the second Governor General preceding Bentinck, had actually banned it for 2 years. But in these 2 years, he faced a volley of opposition from the Brahmanical class and from Hindus as a whole. Much of it was manufactured, and he withdrew. So they were unable to understand the mood of the Indians, which prohibited them from taking the ultimate step. And in this building up this mood, the single person who comes to our mind is Ram Mohan Roy, who starts his battle in 1814 and continues unabated till it is abolished on the 4th of December, 1829. He builds up that mood and public opinion that would facilitate the actual banning of Sati. But more important than that is the role that what Bentinck had not assumed was that he had, of course, he must have, I have no proof, but he must have sounded his court of directors that he was about to take a step that was against the legacy of English rule in India by banning Sati, and that they would perhaps support him, which they did. But he had not taken into account that the Hindu obscurantist lobby would go all the way to pull in money to hire the best English lawyers and to appeal to the Privy Council. Bentinck had no remedy against the Privy Council. The campaign in the Privy Council was done physically by Ram Mohan Roy from April 1830 till it was abolished in 11th of July, 1832. He has no direct, this was one point that most of these arguments about Bentinck had made up his mind to, because had it not been for this victory in the Privy Council, and the Privy Council victory was by a 1 vote, so you'll understand how tenuous it was, that even 1 vote had gone on the other side, it would be an equal. And if 2 votes had gone on the other side, it would be back to Sati. This was his mission that left him completely broken physically and mentally, and he died within a few months of this. What we need to, I don't know how much time we have, but I'll just quickly go through some of the points. What we need to understand is the role of actors in this, because we can't take a monolithic view of who acted how. One of the major impediments that stood in Ram Mohan's path was the Asiatic Society. the one that we hold in the highest of light, and the Orientalist. The Orientalist lobby was deeply soaked, if I may use the term, mindlessly soaked, was trying to create a construct on the basis of text. It was on the job for working out an imagined theocracy that prevailed in India before they came. They were looking for the magic book of Indian law. And I'll give an example of what are the first 4 or 5 publications that they brought about. Apart from Manu, reinstating Manu, the emphasis on other religious texts, Colebrook brought out Colebrook, incidentally, the second president of the Asiatic Society, brought out in 1795 a most authoritative text known as On the Duties of a Faithful Hindu Widow, in which it quotes chapter and verse on Sahamaran, that is, Sati. It was, I'm just bringing in the twist, I can't go to get into this debate, on how he faced and how much this text of Colebrook influenced European English policy for tolerating sati. Then when we look at the Asiatic Society, we need to view, I'm not blaming the whole society, it's left behind the trail of wisdom. I'm leaving behind phases that people go through. As I said, it reinforced a Brahmanism that did not exist in reality until these texts that were prescriptive in nature were being bandied around, that were prescriptive in nature were being bandied around as descriptive and mandatory. This imagine. On the other hand, there's an English body that plays a very unusual role in going against sati. Yes, sir. So, going against sati, and this is the Nizamat Adalat. The Nizamat Adalat goes against sati in a very persuasive manner. I'll just run through, and in his debate from 1809 itself, Barnett Cohn incidentally raised this point that through his debate and his continuous argument, Ram Mohan creates the earliest discursive space in modern India, the first person to raise discourse in modern India. I have already raised the question about his rights of women, which comes out in his second tract against sati in 1819. There are other reasons, and in his book in 1822 known as The Ancient Rights of Females According to Hindu Law of Inheritance. Here he takes his position on Hindu law of inheritance, questions Bengal's Daibhag system, which incidentally was more liberal than others, and reinforces his demand for greater rights. We are all aware of his role in English education. What we are perhaps not aware is that when his greatest occasion arose for spreading English education in the establishment Hindu College or Presidency College, he was thrown out. He was not allowed by the Hindu theocracy at that time to be anywhere near the establishment of it. Ram Mohan incidentally was one of the first crusaders for freedom of press. He himself was an erudite journalist, the Sangbad Kaumadi and others, and he was the one who put up the most vocal opposition against the press, against the government, the Act of 1833. He resigned from, shut down his own paper, his own newspaper, in protest against the Vernacular Act, Press Act. We have already referred to Brahmon's cross-cultural skills. Just must mention that the first text in which he expresses his religious thought was neither in Sanskrit nor in Bangla, but he brought out a text in Persian with an introduction in Arabic called Tuhfat, my accent will be terrible, Tuhfat ul Muhaddin, where it's a text form, it's a call for monotheism. There are issues that's why he brought about. He was the first person to link up the freedom struggles of the world. He brought out in 1822 his first article on Ireland, the causes of distress, and brings up the Irish question, links it up with the Indian one. He celebrates the Spanish victory. He celebrates the victory of the French Revolution. And he actually organizes international seminars, 3 international seminars between 1818 and 1822 in the Kolkata Town Hall. The first internationalist Indian who tries to link the struggles of people all over the world in terms of what India was going through. I'll just sum up by mentioning that here, as the first Indian, we need to view him in terms of not only the 12 or 14 great achievements that he has given, but the core of the thought that drives him all along. Rationality, cross-culturalism, plurality, and courage. Thank you very much.
Now I would like to welcome Professor Aditya Mukherjee, please.
I'm grateful to the organizers of the History Congress and the symposium, particularly Irfan Saab and Professor Musvi for inviting me to speak in this symposium. I'm particularly proud to be speaking on Jawaharlal Nehru, who, next to Gandhiji, was clearly a critical figure in the making of modern India. For nearly 50 years of our nation's history, he played an important part in giving a clear, progressive direction to the evolution of our nation during the national liberation struggle. And in the last 2 decades of his life, almost single-handedly, because Patel died in 1950, and so did the Mahatma, was already dead, almost single-handedly carved out the destiny of the newly independent nation that was born. So undoubtedly, the inclusion of Jawaharlal Nehru in the makers of modern India is absolutely essential. Like, again, Mahatma Gandhi, he was next to Gandhiji in being demonized relentlessly by those who did not stand for the idea of India, which was imagined by our freedom struggle. Gandhiji, as you know, was physically murdered, and a similar attempt is made now to wipe out Nehru and his legacy from the memory of the Indian people. The attack, understandably, has come from 2 different directions, both opposed to the national liberation struggle. That is, the attack has come from the colonialists or the neo-colonialists, and the communalists on Gandhi, on Nehru. I want to make this point because quite often the umbilical cord which links the communalists with the imperialists is often forgotten, especially since the communalists now masquerade as nationalists. It is forgotten that not only were they not part of the national movement, they were in fact the other side of imperialism. In fact, they performed the role with active help of the colonial state in becoming the main bulwark against the growth of Indian nationalism. The neo-colonial attack has come from a range of neo-colonial thinkers. I talked about them yesterday, people like Meghnad Desai, Tirthankar Roy, etc., who critique particularly the Nehruvian era after independence as I said, as the wasted years. They believe, and this view has caught on in the current neoliberal mood that the country has decided to adopt. They have propagated the belief that had it not been for Nehru, India would have made fantastic progress. Because as I said yesterday again, they argue that after the globalization of the colonial period, which was very favorable to India in their opinion, in the neo-colonial opinion, the other favorable thing that has happened to India is the globalization since the 1990s. They conflate these two globalizations, which is, to use a mild word, idiotic, because these are two completely different phases of globalization. One occurs under colonial hegemony, and the second occurs in a situation where there are independent nation states who independently choose to enter the phase of globalizations, differently of course, some more ably, some less ably, some who get swallowed by the globalization process, and some are able to take advantage of the globalization process, in which process even the communist countries such as China joined. So, participation in globalization is not just one kind of participation. And thirdly, I'll keep my comments on the globalization process in India for a later discussion. The main criticism of Nehru comes because of his economic policies post-independence, because of his support for the public sector, his protecting Indian industry, the notion of protectionism, the idea of import substituting industrialization strategy, etc. Now these are now vilified as wrong strategies, which is what has costed India very dearly. In other words, had we adopted the 1991 strategy in 1950, then we would have gone places. As I said, this is no less than idiotic, because had India adopted the 1991 strategy in 1950, then India would have been a banana republic by now. It just did not make sense at that point of time. Nehru was not the obstruction to Indian development. Nehru created the conditions that you could, in the 1990s or 30 to 40 years after independence, now open up to the world with advantage to yourself. If you had opened up in the 1950s, as I said, we would have become a banana republic. Just as remaining a closed economy in the 1990s would also be an unacceptable situation. As Cardozo, the left dependency thinker who brought Brazil into the globalization process, had said, the question you should ask is not whether to globalize or not. He said the days of the Iron Curtain and the Bamboo Curtain are over. Globalization is a fact. The question you should ask is, Do we globalize with a safety net for the poor? Do we globalize while keeping our sovereignty intact? Or do we globalize by disappearing into the armpit of the United States and by completely ignoring the rights and privileges of the working class? In other words, he was in fact arguing with the Indian left. He was saying, as leftists, you should ask the question, how do you globalize? Not whether to globalize or not. And Nehru's role was to create the conditions that India could at least attempt to participate in the globalization process with some bargaining power. The other kind of attack, and I will have a little bit to say on this a little later, comes naturally from the communalists who've accused him of being pseudo-secular, of promoting minority communalism, and almost every conceivable evil that you can think of is now attached to his name. I mean, he's supposed to have ignored agriculture, he's supposed to have promoted capital good industries, heavy industries, and ignored consumer good industries. He is supposed to have ignored primary education in favor of higher education. He's supposed to have brought about a land reform, which was completely mutilated. It was not a land reform at all. Everything, as I said, he did was wrong. And therefore, our Prime Minister either forgets to mention him when he speaks from the ramparts of the Red Fort, where he mentions every other person that he can think of in the national movement, and he can't think much because he's not fully educated, but he remembers some names like Tilak and Aurobindo, etc., and Malviya, and forgets to mention Jawaharlal Nehru. And under this kind of thinking, Nehru has been completely deleted. There are textbooks in Rajasthan where there, and this is all over the press, you must have read about it, where you have chapters on the national movement where Nehru's name does not enter. There is no Jawaharlal Nehru in your national movement. Gandhiji makes only a 1 or 2 line entry, more about his martyrdom or his murder than anything else. And the bulk of the book is about the role of Savarkar and Golwalkar and others. And it, of course, makes no mention of the apologies that Savarkar had made to the colonial state. Every other day, you are now hearing that if only Nehru had not been there, if only Patel had been the Prime Minister, then we would not have had a Kashmir problem, India would have grown very rapidly, etc., etc. Everything else would have been right. And of course, there is an effort to, through lies, to denigrate the image of Jawaharlal Nehru, even suggesting that he had something to do with the disappearance of Subhash Bose. So every attempt is made to posit somebody against Nehru so that Nehru's image somehow is diminished. So whether you're going to use Gandhiji to do that, or you're going to use Subhash Bose to do that, or Patel to do that, the objective is to demolish Nehru. As I said, while Gandhiji was shot, the attempt is to liquidate Nehru as much. And as one of the elected legislators of the BJP, an RSS man, in fact, publicly said that Godse fired the wrong bullet. I mean, he killed the wrong person. He should have actually killed Nehru and not Gandhi. All right, enough of the negative part. Now, why is all this not correct? Nehru, in my opinion, quintessentially represent what we call the idea of India. And if I am to summarize in 30 seconds what that idea of India is, which is again represented in our constitution and which reflects nearly 100-year-old freedom struggle that happened in India. The idea of India is the crystallization of this 100-year-old struggle on which there was a consensus from the left to the right. So the idea of India is not Gandhian, it's not Nehruite, it's not communist, it's all of it. And this is something that we must recognize, that this is what the Indian people of all political hues accepted. And the four basic elements of that, on which there was no dispute, was that the future India will be sovereign and anti-imperialist. India would be against imperialism. That was, of course, the central idea with which the nation was built. Number two, that it would be democratic and civil libertarian. The second most powerful idea that was pushed throughout the national movement, and the national movement, as has been said, as has been so brilliantly brought out by the previous speakers, was also owning up and adopting the best values from our ancient and medieval past. They were taking the best from Ashok, they were taking the best from Akbar, they were taking the best from Ram Mohan. And democracy and civil liberties, particularly the civil liberties aspect, was taken from our past. Similarly, the third element, so it was anti-imperialism, democracy, secularism. The phrase that traditionally one has always used together is secular democracy, because you cannot be a democracy without being secular, and you cannot be secular without being democratic. If you're not secular, then you are forced to be suppressing some part of your people, so you cannot be democratic. And the fourth element, on which there was again an agreement, which is often not realized, was that the future India would be pro-poor. That this is not only a socialist or communist idea. This was part of our national liberation struggle from its very inception. Dadabhai Naoroji's first book is Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. Every moderate leader that you can read, you will find that they start their premises on the question, why is there poverty in India? And then they link it to imperialism, whether it is Rana Day, whether it is Tilak, whether it is Surendra Banerjee, or Dadabhai Naoroji. So these were the four principles. And Nehru absorbed all of them, and I will, in the next few minutes, try to summarize for you how he in fact tries to build all of them. The first challenge to Nehru, I will try and keep to my time. The first challenge to Nehru comes at the birth of the nation itself. And the challenge comes from the communal forces. Because as you know, independence comes to India in a situation which can only be compared to the Holocaust. It comes in a Holocaust-like situation where at least 500,000 people were killed, many, many more millions were made homeless. Communal frenzy had reached its peak, the country was partitioned, and then the greatest Indian we had produced was murdered. Now, in that situation, Nehru has to try and build a secular India. And I would say that he really rises to his full stature when he resists this challenge of communalism at the birth of the nation itself. That is, and this was, by the way, Nehru points it out repeatedly, that the Mahatma was not murdered just as an accident. It was not just one madman who went and killed him. In his letters to the chief minister, he repeatedly says that this was an attempted coup. There was an attempt to change the nature of the state, that it was seen as an opportunity by the Hindu right, or the Hindutva forces, or the RSS, particularly the RSS. He names it, he says it was an attempt by the RSS to utilize this communally flared up situation to build a Hindu India as a counterpart to Muslim Pakistan. And this is what he resists with all his might. As you know, that when the riots happen, in Noakhali and then in Bihar, where the Muslims are killed, Noakhali, Gandhiji goes himself. And when the riots happen in Bihar in November 46, Nehru is the interim prime minister of the interim government. He reaches Bihar, 5 minutes? Yeah. He reaches Bihar with his entire cabinet. Patel, Prasad, Azad, JP, Kripalani, etc., etc. He lands up in Bihar and he says that, to quote him, "I will stand in the way of Hindu-Muslim riots. Members of both communities will have to tread over my dead body before they can strike each other." And he says, "I will not move out of Bihar till the rioting has stopped." And within a week, it is completely stopped. To what I'm trying to suggest, and of course, contrast this to what happens in Gujarat, what happened in Muzaffarnagar. Nobody seems to accept making a flying visit. But that's not how you stop it. The main thing that Nehru does is, after Gandhiji's assassination, he turns the first general election into virtually a referendum. He travels something like 40,000 kilometers. He addresses about 35 million people one-to-one, like I'm talking to you. 1/10 of the Indian population is addressed by him at that time. He is completely, like a mad frenzy. He turns this election into a referendum, which is, are the Indian people going to create, through election, a Hindu state? Or are we going to make a secular India? And mind you, this is happening just at the end of this Holocaust-like situation, when emotions are so high. And he succeeds. We have a peaceful election. I don't think we give it enough weight. The fact that we have a peaceful election just weeks after the rioting, etc., has ended, in which the Indian people overwhelmingly reject the Hindu communal idea, which is one of the greatest successes, I would say, of the national movement and Jawaharlal Nehru and at this point of time. Overwhelmingly. The Ram Raj Parishad, the Jan Sangh, and all the Hindu Mahasabha, etc., all put together, they keep changing their names after they've made one offense or the other. They all came together, they got only 6% of the votes, and only 10 Lok Sabha seats out of 489. So the Indian people had overwhelmingly voted towards for a secular India, and this is one of Nehru's greatest achievements. The other three elements of the idea of India, let me take one minute each on this. Nehru's effort to build a democracy, create a democracy out of a newly born nation. Again, his letters to the chief ministers are very, very illustrative. 5 volumes of them are available, and it's well worth having a look at it. He is repeatedly, week after week, trying to educate the MPs, trying to educate the chief ministers, trying to educate the Indian people how to build a democracy, in which he says, critical to a democracy is opposition. Not opposition mukt, which is what our current communal fascists believe. The killing of opposition is not creating a democracy, but creating the opposition is democracy. And Nehru repeatedly, on several occasions, takes steps to ensure that. One of the very often quoted examples is that when Nehru finds that there is no criticism coming of him, he actually wrote, with a pseudonym of Chanakya, wrote articles about him where he criticized himself mercilessly, saying that this man is becoming dictatorial, unless he is controlled, it is not good for India, etc., etc. So there are many lessons to be learned. I don't have time to give you details about this, but there is, I think he played a very, very important role in this. And one thing he repeated very often, he said, this country is too large a country with too many diversities to permit any one so-called strong man to come and emerge as the savior. You can understand how relevant this is in these days of 56 inches being shown around. His achievement on the sovereignty front is, I think, again another element which is forgotten. When India got independence, we got only political independence. Economically, we were as dependent on the first world as we were before independence. More than 90% of the capital goods required for making any investment at independence had to be imported. Nearly 95% of even your machine tools, that is your pliers and wrenches, had to be imported. So from 1945 onwards, planning on future independent India, delegations started going all over the world saying, how are we going to industrialize without capital goods, without machines? Where are we going to get them? We can't, like the Allied forces, seek reparations from Germany and take away their factories and put them in their own countries. So how are we going to do it? So what Nehru does is, and particularly through the second plan, what is called the Nehru-Mahalanobis plan, he focuses on removing this economic dependence. After all, that is what neocolonialism is all about. You have political independence, and the world was replete with examples of this. You get political independence, but you have no real independence at all from the countries from whom you've got political independence. So he creates the economic basis for independence, and I'll give you just one example to demonstrate this. The Nehru-Mahalanobis plan succeeds in doing the following. At independence, India had to import, as I said, virtually 100% of the machines required in order to make any investment, that is to grow, that is to have industrialization. In the Nehruvian period, 1950 to 65, industry grew at 7% per annum, which is not which is a very considerable figure for a newly industrializing country. And the important thing is that the threefold increase in the aggregate index of industrial production that happens between 51 and 69, 70% of the increase was because of consumer goods. There was a quadrupling of intermediate goods, and there was a tenfold increase in the output of capital goods. So this industrial growth that you see in this period had a tenfold increase in the capital goods. The result was that there was a structural transformation of the Indian economy. There was an unstructuring of the colonial economy that was made hothouse manner in the course of just 15 years. The result was that by the 1960s, you had to import only 43%, and by 1974, only 9% of the capital goods required to maintain your industrialization process. Only 9%. In other words, India could manage to grow 91% based on its own capital goods. Now, this is what independence was all about, and this is what made it possible for India to have an independent foreign policy, one of the most independent foreign policies in the world. It was possible, to lead the non-aligned movement, to get about 100 countries to be neither with the United States, to be with neither of the major power blocks. It was a great achievement that one must remember. Yeah? All right. I have to end now. Let me just mention in one words two of the other achievements. It is, at least, let me just deny the fact that to suggest that somebody of Nehru's capacity ignored agriculture, that he did not see the link between agriculture and industry. You could not have had the Green Revolution if you had not had created the capacities to both create power, electricity, pumps, diesel, fertilizers. You would not have had the Green Revolution. He created the conditions for that. So there is, no, I'm finishing. Give me a minute. I know lunch is waiting. But I will not have completed unless I make the chairman, sir, give me just 2 seconds more. Two very major interventions that he makes. which is that Nehru anticipates the knowledge revolution by about half a century. If you look at the first plan is not talking about building bridges and dams and steel plants. The first plan is talking about, it's a worth a read. It's talking about building your IITs, building your Bhabha Atomic Research Center, building your National Physical Laboratory, National Chemical Laboratory. Every conceivable institution that now exists was more or less planned in that period. The result of that was that having missed the earlier industrial revolutions, the next time round, when there was an opportunity for participating in a revolution, the information revolution, India was prepared for it. And Nehru made a major contribution in that. I just had to mention this for you. I will have to leave out his role in the pro-poor direction and end by saying that what had become, one of the most commonly known facts, the link between Nehru and the scientific temper. Nehru's attempt to pull Indian people, Nehru, and I'm now using him as a shortcut for the national liberation struggle, to try and pull the Indian people up to a more rational, more scientific, to a more modern stage, has been completely reversed. The scientific temper is perhaps today one of the greatest things under attack. So all of these elements of the idea of India, our sovereignty is under question, our secularism is under tremendous attack, which is, I believe, currently the biggest danger to our nation. And the pro-poor orientation is under severe attack. We've grown for the last 20, nearly 30 years at 6 to 8% rates of growth. And even today, 65% of our children are malnourished. I mean, I don't have to give you figures of the completely unequal growth that we have seen in the last few years. So complete abdication of responsibility towards the poor, which did not exist in the Nehruvian times and even in the post-Nehruvian times till at least the 1980s. Completely rejecting that. And lastly, as I said, a concerted attack through the education system and through the media against a scientific temper. Where again, as I said, where the Prime Minister leads by telling the people to believe, concocted theories, to believe mythology, to, in a country like India, imagine somebody, the Prime Minister, arguing that we knew plastic surgery in ancient India. Otherwise, how did Ganesha get an elephant head? So we do not create nationalists by doing that, as was said in a report produced by the NCERT about a few decades ago. By doing this kind of an education, we produce morons. Let us not make our children into morons. And let us, I believe, follow the example that was laid by the intelligentsia of the 19th and 20th centuries in creating a new India. The Indian intelligentsia needs to regrow a spine. The Indian intelligentsia, which today the bulk of the educated people thinks that the best thing they can do is how to migrate to the West, is something that we need a very big rethink about. Thank you very much.
Friends, I think we have had a veritable feast for the intellect. I'm sorry to the speakers for having been strict with the time, because it had to be managed. Now, all the 4 presentations are open for discussion. So if there are some queries, please. Please.
If I understood the question, this is that when we praise people like Ashok or Akbar or Jawaharlal Nehru or Ram Mohan Roy for what they wrote, then do we make those writings sacrosanct? You mentioned edicts. Of course, a lawyer's answer would be that edict is our name for what Ashoka wrote. He didn't invent this name. He was simply addressing people. So, of course, we are not making text sacrosanct. We have to learn what other people thought. We have to give credit where the credit is due. Therefore, I don't think there's any contradiction in it. One can't agree. Ashoka's times were different, Akbar's times were different. We can't agree with many things they said. But what is important is the new things they did. And certainly, if there is cosmopolitanism, if you have an open mind about others, if you have reason, if you subscribe to reason, as Akbar did, for example, as Jawaharlal Nehru did, as Ram Mohan Roy did, then that's to be celebrated. So celebration doesn't mean that we are just simply following those people, but we are doing credit where there's due, and perhaps we ought to imitate also.
There's much by way of economic ideas that Ramon has given. From whatever we have culled out from his writings, he was in favor of free trade. He was a product of his time, you must realize. And we are talking of Ram Mohan's economics from 1820 to 1833, 23 years. He was in favor of free trade, which meant that he was against the East India Company's monopoly. And he made submissions to this effect in the against the East India Company before the British Parliament. That requires guts. Number two, he was in favor of expansion of capital within India to develop in the Indian economy, and this capital for him meant British capital. He has been severely criticized for being open to British capital and British expansionism. But then even Marxist writers have taken this down, that he was a product of his time, and he could not see the acquisition of Indian capital for expansion of the modernization of the economy. Just one question to this lady, just a small thing came to my mind. You see, to understand Ashok, you have to understand his counterpart in China, Qin Shi Huangdi. They are separated by 11 years. Between the Battle of their epochal years are 11, or if you can take it, 2 decades. Qin Shi Huangdi sets up the Chinese agenda. One language, one people, one currency, one size of the axles of carts. That is the degree of homogenization that sets the nation, and the degree of steamrollering that China would follow in its ethnic policy. If you look at the edicts of Ashok, the variation that was allowed, the softness of address, does not speak in terms of a predetermined discourse. No, it just came to my mind that the two difference between the genetic makeup of India and the genetic makeup of China would be traced to the third century, when we find the difference between just 20 years separating the founders of the idea of India and the founder of the idea of China. Just a thought that came to mind. So in other words, none of them had this impositional urge to be giving you a perfect ideology for you to follow perfectly. It is those who stand contrary to the idea of India who bring about what they consider a perfect ideology that has to be perfectly accepted or else face dire consequences. Thank you.
I would like to On behalf of all of us, thank all the 4 speakers for 4 brilliant presentations, and thank you all for your kind patience. Thank you.